There were many airmen who flew in the Second World War on high-altitude combat missions. One of these airmen was Staff Sergeant Henry Culver, who was an engineer, ball turret, and waist gunner on a B-24 bomber. His son, Scott Culver, has set out to write about his father's exploits during the war, from his first enlistment to his combat missions over Nazi-occupied Europe. In doing this, Scott has been physically tracing his father's footsteps through that military experience. Let's find out more about what Scott has been doing following the path of his father during World War II. Well, welcome to our program Contours, Scott.
Thank you, Carl. I appreciate you having me on.
Let me ask you, what got you started in writing about your father's experiences in World War II?
Well, I grew up in a household listening to my father's stories from the time I was old enough to understand him, from ages 4 and 5. I remember him showing me his medals and showing me a photo of him receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross. And from that point on, he had me hooked and very interested in what his experiences were about.
Okay. Now, he's since passed away, hasn't he?
Yes, he just passed away 3.5 years ago.
Okay. Now, in thinking about his experiences, what have you done so far?
Well, I've traveled all across the United States to the bases that he had trained at, and then across Europe to the air base he was stationed at in England, and at different places where he had flown combat missions too.
Now, where would that be? Where would you have gone to do this?
Well, he was stationed in Tivenham, England, which is just about 10 or 12 miles outside of Norwich, which is up in the East Anglia region of England.
Yeah.
And from there, he flew combat missions over France and Germany, 30 missions in total.
Okay. Wow, that's quite a few in the way of missions, I would imagine, right?
Yes, it was 25 missions to start, but halfway through his tour of duty, the 8th Air Force decided to up it to 30 missions because they felt that they were gaining a little more air superiority with the fighter coverage that was protecting our bombers all the way to the targets and back.
Yeah. Now, while he was in, I mentioned he was a waist gunner and a ball turret gunner. When you say ball turret, what turret would that be?
Well, the ball turret was a sphere that hung on underneath the belly of the plane. On the B-24, it was retractable, so it would be lowered from inside of the plane once he had gotten inside of it, and he would be hanging underneath the belly of the plane, able to rotate 360 degrees, and he would be firing basically at enemy fighters that would either be approaching from underneath or ones that dove in from the top. Once they went under the plane, he would track them and try and shoot them down.
Now, he was an engineer as well. That would mean that he would have to go through engineer training. That's an engineer on board, a flight engineer, I would imagine, on board the aircraft itself. And he'd have to go through training to be a gunner as well, wouldn't he?
Yes, what happened was after basic training in Atlantic City, New Jersey, they sent him down by rail to Goldsboro, North Carolina for tech school. There he trained for 3 months as an airplane mechanic and an engineer. And at the end of his course, they were offering gunnery school tests because they needed aerial gunners, and he qualified. So from there, they sent him down to Buckingham Army Airfield, which is near Fort Myers, Florida. And there he did 6 weeks of gunnery school and qualified with a high score, and then they put him on a heavy bomber from there.
Oh, wow. So on any one mission, did he operate in all those positions as engineer and a gunner, or just one of them on each mission?
Well, he was an assistant engineer, and what that meant was if something had happened to the main flight engineer, who was the top turret gunner, my father would take his position, and he would help the pilot and the co-pilot by calling out altitude and airspeed. And what he would do typically is be in the ball turret position, and at other times he would fly in the waist gun as it was needed.
Okay. All right. So it depends on what position was needed to be filled, I suppose, on any mission, huh?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, on these missions, what kind of combat did he get involved in? And I'm sure he was fired upon by both the German aircraft and also from the flak from the ground artillery.
Yes, that's correct. In fact, I'll give you a little synopsis of one of his most dangerous missions. They were flying to Nuremberg, Germany on February 25th of 1944, and it was their deepest penetration into Germany with the 8th Air Force at that point. So they were bombing airplane installations like factories and anything that would repair German fighter aircraft. So what the Germans typically did was they would dive in 8 to 10 abreast, typically from the 12 o'clock high position, and all gunners had to be on alert and looking at all positions around the clock to see where they were coming from.
Yeah.
And like you said, besides the German fighter attacks, on this one mission, anti-aircraft artillery was being fired at them, and pretty accurately. Jimmy Stewart, who was my father's commander, he was in the lead plane in that formation, and my father was flying as his wingman that day.
Oh, really?
And that's another part of the story we'll get to in a moment.
Okay.
But on this particular mission, right after bombs away, they had just dropped the bombs, bombed the target. An anti-aircraft shell that was a dud went through the plane,
Whoa.
ripped through the bomb bay, and tore out the armor plating off of the pilot's back seat. Just missed the pilot by inches. It blew a hole out the side of the plane, and it sucked out a pair of combat boots that were on the flight deck, a spare pair of boots, and a packed parachute went out the hole. It went over the wing, and that day my father was flying at the left waist gun position, and the debris that got sucked out the hole hit his waist gun and ripped the sight right off the gun and ripped the gun right out of his hands.
Wow, fantastic. Wow. So what about...
an experience.
Yeah, I can imagine. How about some other experiences? Do you have anything in mind involving other experiences that you might be writing about in the book that you're coming up with?
Yes, my father was on the first daylight raids over Berlin. So when the 8th Air Force first made it to Berlin all the way, he was on the first raid, the first two raids actually, in early March of 44. And I remember him telling me he looked out of his waist gun window and saw 1,000 planes in the air that day on our side.
Whoa. What kind of... go ahead. I was going to ask what kind of planes.
I was just going to say, about a month after that, a month and a half later, they also flew to Berlin. It was their second or third mission. And on that particular mission, as with the other ones, the Germans threw everything up at them. And to put it in my father's exact words, he said they threw everything up at us except for the kitchen sink.
Yeah.
And he said on that mission, April 29th of 1944, his oxygen mask froze up when he was flying at the left waist gun position.
Oh.
He passed out. He hit the gunner behind him to let him know he was passing out. Thank God that day, the gunner behind him, Billy Fields, just happened to have a spare oxygen mask with him.
Whoa.
Just that day.
Coincidentally, huh? Wow, fantastic.
Yeah, well, it gets better. You got to hear the rest of this. So he passes out. The other gunner is trying to get the new mask on, but they're being strafed by another wave of German fighters. So he has to hold the mask on my father's face with his foot while he's returning enemy fire.
Oh, no. Oh, wow.
Yeah, once there was a break in the fire, he finally got the mask strapped onto my father's leather helmet, and my father's out cold the whole time. He doesn't know what's going on.
Yeah.
They call the bombardier back to take my father's place. He winds up getting wounded in the thigh with shrapnel, and a fire starts in the plane, and the bombardier beats it out with his gloved hands.
Oh, no.
So they finally get my father revived after about a half hour, and when there's a little break in the combat, he comes to, and they tell him all that had happened. Now, the kicker is when the bombardier took his place and he was still passed out, a German fighter dove in and shot around the machine gun fire. Just at that moment, as the bullets were entering the plane, a shell exploded under the plane and made the plane bounce. Bouncing knocked my father over on his side, so the spray of machine gun fire missed his chest by inches.
Oh.
So now you can see why I'm writing this book. It's incredible stories, many incredible stories like that to be told.
Wow. Do you have any other points of interest you might want to talk about in terms of what you're including in the book that you're writing?
Well, one of the key features of the book is the fact that my father flew with Jimmy Stewart, the movie actor.
Yeah. So he was in the same plane, in other words, as Jimmy Stewart.
Yes, he flew as a training pilot on my father's plane when they trained in the United States. And then when they went into combat, Stewart led the group, and my father's squadron particularly, he was a squadron commander. Stewart would lead the whole group as well as the squadron on the missions, and my father's plane typically flew as deputy lead, which was high right, just to Stewart's plane.
Yeah.
And my father had many interesting encounters with Jimmy Stewart during the war.
Oh, by the way, we're speaking to our guest, who is Scott Culver, and he's writing a book about his father's exploits, Henry Culver, during the Second World War as a gunner and engineer on a B-24 bomber. And we're finding out information about what kind of experiences his father had during the war. Now you mentioned Jimmy Stewart. So what was his take on Jimmy Stewart? What was his reaction to Jimmy, both as an actor, star actor, and now in the military as a pilot?
Well, my father had nothing but good words to say about Jimmy Stewart. He said, and he always said this to me growing up. He said, the way you see him in the movies is the way he was in real life.
Really?
A real man, down to earth, never shirked his responsibilities. He was faithful to his duties in combat, and Stewart flew the most dangerous missions that his group flew.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
My father was on the most dangerous missions with him, and one of them I had already mentioned to you.
Yeah. So, again, how many missions did your father fly?
He flew 30.
And, 30 missions. And was he wounded in any of these?
The worst thing he did not get any direct wounds per se from shrapnel or bullets or anything like that, but he had gotten frostbite on 2 of his missions, and his fingers had turned so black they were almost going to amputate them. Because at high altitude, if you are not in an electric flying suit or well covered, it can get from anywhere to 30 to 60 below zero.
Now, what altitude was he flying at?
They typically flew between 18 and 24,000 feet in B-24s.
That's quite some altitude. I guess they would have to fly that altitude, seeing that they were doing daylight bombing.
Well, and that's right. That's why the book is titled Daylight Raiders. As my father always said, the Americans flew daylight raids because they wanted to be more accurate in their bombing, whereas the British flew at night. They felt it was safer for the bomber crews, which was true, but their accuracy was not as good as daylight precision bombing.
Ah, okay. And go ahead.
No, I was going to say, but of course, flying during the day, you're a much easier target to see by your enemy.
Oh, certainly. So you're more accurate, but you're more of a target as well.
Exactly.
So I guess they thought that trade-off was worthwhile. I don't know. You're like sitting ducks.
That's right. The 8th Air Force really pushed for daylight bombing, even though the British wanted them to join them at night. Daylight, they believed, would end the war sooner, and I think to a certain extent they were right.
Okay. Wow, so all this took place during daylight, and I guess in the beginning of the bombing missions, at the somewhere near the beginning of the war, they didn't have any kind of fighter escort beyond a certain point because the fighters at that time didn't have enough of distance to fly. They didn't have enough fuel to carry to fly the distance back and forth to protect the bombers. But later on in the war, we had come up with the P-51 Mustang that was able to fly that distance with extra tanks included on the aircraft itself, so they could do that. So what happened during the beginning of the war versus later on when they had the Mustang accompany them?
Well, and that's a great question, Carl. My father made that point to me many times. Even when he arrived in the combat theater in late 1943, the P-51s were just being introduced in the ETO, the European Theater of Operations. And my father watched the early models come into the war, which didn't have the drop tanks and the fuel to go all the way to Berlin with them.
Yeah.
But by February of 44, just a few months later, the 8th Air Force had developed the drop tanks, and they were escorting the bombers all the way to Berlin and back.
I'd like to thank you for being on Contours to talk about the book you're writing about your father's experiences during the Second World War as a gunner and engineer on a B-24 bomber. Well, I wish you well in finishing your book. It sounds like it would be interesting reading once it is finished and published.
Well, I appreciate the time, Carl. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure, and I look forward to the finished product myself as well.
Okay, then. Take care, and good luck to you.
All right, thank you, Carl. You take care, too.
Okay.
That's it for this week's edition of Contours, your weekly roundup of what's happening in the WNTI listening area and the surrounding communities. Thank you to everyone who made today's show possible. Contours is a production of WNTI and can be heard Sundays at 9 a.m. with a rebroadcast on our website, WNTI.org. If you have a topic you'd like to hear discussed on a future edition of Contours or a comment on today's show, just send me an email, tilm@centenarycollege.edu. That's THIELM@centenarycollege.edu. Have a great week, everyone.